All right, welcome everyone. Happy, is it a Tuesday today? It feels a little bit like a Monday here in Massachusetts. Yesterday was a Patriots Day where we usually run the marathon. Unfortunately, that was canceled this year. Um, but happy Arbor Week. Friday is also happens to be Arbor Day, national holiday celebrated since 1872, and tomorrow is also Earth Day. So welcome as we celebrate the power of trees, power of earth, and the power of nature. Um, my name is David Meshulam. I am executive director and co-founder of Speak for the Trees in Boston. And we are an urban and community forestry organization committed to improving the size and health of the urban forests in Boston and connecting people to trees. For the past couple of weeks, we've developed a community conversations platform for us to connect people and have a co-creative process where we can talk about the importance of our urban forest and think about it through the lens of equity and environmental justice. We've had a couple of topics so far. A couple of weeks ago, for our first session, we spoke about the urban forest, past, present, and future, and thinking about its effects on things like global climate change and the urban heat island effect. Last week, we were joined by Catherine Walsh from Boston Public Schools and Raquel Jimenez, a graduate student at BU, and they spoke about the relationship between trees and student health and student learning. And this week, we're pleased to be joined by three speakers, David Haskell, Jeff Perrin, and Judith Foster. Introduce them in a minute. But before I do, I just wanted to welcome everyone and for this conversation. We're hoping that this will be an open conversation for the second half of our time together, where you can have a chance to ask questions of each other and of our speakers today. Please stay muted. So the mute button is on the bottom left of your screen. If you have something you'd like to say, feel free to unmute yourself, but it would be nice if you remuted yourself, just so that sometimes a cacophony can get a bit overwhelming if there are too many people speaking. We also ask that you keep your comments appropriate. People will be removed for inappropriate comments and behavior. That's happened in the past, unfortunately. We like to make a safe space here where people feel comfortable in sharing ideas and expressing themselves. As you're arriving, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat window. Be great for people to get to know each other, share your name, your organization, what brought you here today, and if you have a memory or a favorite tree or a memory of an experience with the tree, we encourage you to share that. Finally, also feel free to use the chat window to just share ideas as they emerge during the presentation. So before I hand it over to Evan, I just, instead of sharing a screen, I thought I would share a little flyer here about our work and following up with what we do at Speak for the Trees. We're doing a couple of really great projects. We're delivering trees in the next coming weeks. So you can sign up at sfttbos.org/getatree. Join our mission in so many other ways. We're social. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Sign up for our newsletter, or please donate. And I just was telling the panelists today, a couple of months ago, I had pre-ordered some saplings from Bartlett Trees. They had generously donated, they're gonna say 100 saplings. Well, today the guy showed up and I have 300 saplings in my basement, and I'm looking to get rid of them, not get rid of them. I'm looking for them to find good homes in Boston. So stay tuned. I hope that you will be one of the recipients of these trees if we can find the safe way to get them out of the community. We would love for these trees to find a happy home. So with that, I wanted to thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to Evan.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Evan Curis. I'm the program manager of BU Urban, Boston University Urban Program. We're a PhD training program in urban biogeoscience and environmental health. Basically, we help cities solve environmental challenges. And we're thrilled to partner with Speak for the Trees on this series. We've had some of our students speak in the past, and our next two sessions will feature some PhD students from Boston University working on urban environmental challenges. Here's our water bottle where you can see our logo. and our information's on the Eventbrite. I'm glad to see the introductions here in the chat, and I would like to introduce one of our speakers. David will introduce the other two. They'll have a conversation today about connecting to nature, trees, each other in the midst of a global pandemic. We're gonna have some audience back conversation, and then we're gonna end with a quiz bowl where two lucky audience members will compete to win a t-shirt from Speak for the Trees, and I'll explain how that works at the end. So I'd like to start by introducing one of our speakers, Jeff Perrin. He is an associate professor of psychology at Lesley University in Cambridge. And Jeff focuses on the relationship between people and nature and teaches courses such as eco-psychology, children and nature, Born to be Wild, the psychology of wilderness experience. Don't you wish you could just take those courses? I admire Jeff because of his dedication to making research useful. He's the board president of City Sprouts, a nonprofit focusing on school gardens, and advises NGOs like Mass Audubon to make their programming higher impact. So I'm thrilled to welcome Jeff today, and I'll pass it off to David to introduce our other speakers.
Thank you. It's my distinct honor today to introduce two dear and thoughtful friends and colleagues of mine. David George Haskell is an author of several books, including this one from a couple of years ago, The Songs of Trees. He also is a Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Forest Unseen, which is a wonderful book about his year spent with a 1 square meter of a forest, examining and diarying about that forest. I would like to, David and I met a couple of years ago, and the funny thing about the five of us as we were speaking is we all immediately connected to the Arnold Arboretum. Next week's session is about the Arnold Arboretum, so you'll have a chance to hear about that. But the Arnold Arboretum is a very special place, and David led a wonderful talk there a couple of years ago about sensory, how to experience a tree fully using all our senses. And I'd like, if I could, to read a passage from the book, from the preface, that I think speaks to the theme that we're trying to get at today around trees and our shared humanity. Although tree trunks seemingly stand as detached individuals, their lives subvert this atomistic view. We're all trees, humans, insects, birds, bacteria, pluralities. Life is embodied network. These living networks are not places of omnibenevolent oneness. Instead, they are where ecological and evolutionary tensions between cooperation and conflict are negotiated and resolved. These struggles often result not in the evolution of stronger, more disconnected selves, but in the dissolution of the self into relationship. Because life is network, there is no nature or environment separate and apart from humans. We are part of the community of life composed of relationships with, quote, others. So the human/nature duality that lives near the heart of many philosophies is, from a biological perspective, illusionary. And I can think of no better introduction for our talk today and for our struggles as we face this pandemic, of thinking of the connection that we have to each other and to nature. And finally, it's also my great honor to introduce Judith Foster. Judith and I met a couple of years ago on a project we did together in Dorchester. Judith is the co-founder and director of Hero Nurturing Center, and I'd like to just share a brief video, if I could, of our work together. Hopefully the audio here will work okay for you all.
We're in the Dorchester neighborhood in Boston. This is a very diverse neighborhood. There are people from all over the world. This part of Dorchester has empty, blighted lots. And we know that if we turn places that are ugly into beautiful spaces, we create healthier communities.
Really all throughout the city and every neighborhood of Boston are neighbors coming together to say we want to do something to make food more accessible, to bring nature back into our neighborhood. That's where these food forest gardens have really gotten their energy. It's from the local people.
I'm just so incredibly excited to be collaborating with such an amazing team. I cannot wait to see the end result.
We're here today to really transform this lot into a green space.
This space will serve as a source of access to food, shifting culture, getting people to think more healthy, open green space, and getting people to even come and plant here.
We're unloading some awesome fruit trees here.
Trees represent rootedness. So when you plant a tree, it claims that space for the community.
Gardens heal. It gives you a chance to see something from nothing to its fruition. And this neighborhood needs this revitalization.
So thank you, Judy, for your commitment and your hard work on all these issues. With that, I'd like to just kick off the conversation and turn it over to our panelists today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. And thank you, Evan. And David. Well, we're going to start our conversation. I am Judith Foster, and we're here to discuss our connection to trees. And David Haskell, start us off, please.
Well, connection is the fundamental nature of trees, I think. So our conversation will go in various directions, including urban policy and how to encourage deeper connection. But I think a good place to start is by reminding ourselves that a tree, as we heard from the short reading, is made of interconnection. It's made of living network of community. And when we look at and even give a name to a tree, like, well, that's a sugar maple, or that's a Norway spruce. Well, that name is, in a way, it's a lie, because we're putting one noun on what is, in fact, an incredibly complex and diverse community of life. Within the spruce tree's needles, dozens of species of fungi and bacteria. Its roots live in relationship with bacteria and fungi below the soil. So the tree is so successful, and if trees have been on this planet for 400 million years, their success lies in being incredible hubs of community and of interconnection. And now humans have come along, and of course we are now part of that network, for better and for worse. So there are ways in which connections with trees sustain us, and we sustain them in beautifully reciprocal ways. And then there are examples when our actions are falling out of right relationship with the rest of community of life, and then we have loss of forests and trees in urban areas, and deforestation beyond urban boundaries out in the boreal forest and the Amazon. So my work on trees has come back again and again to this notion of living networks, living communities. And that's true at the microbiological level, inside the leaves of the cells. It's true at the evolutionary level. A tree is a convergence, a knotting together of many different lines of evolutionary heritage. But it's also true at the human and beyond in the cultural realm, where trees serve as such important symbols for people gathering together to work together. So the essence of tree is interconnection, and our language does a poor job of recognizing that, I think, in trying to simplify things by giving them just one name.
Well, I would agree with you in that connection that you speak of, that web of connection. And it's the same with our relationships, if you will, in society, right? With the web of connections that we form each day, each month, and throughout our entire lives. And so we are the trees in all aspects. Would you agree?
Well, I would, and I sort of, I guess, implicit in what you said, I want to underscore that these two networks are not separate things. There's a human cultural network and then a natural network, and then, you know, sometimes they touch, but mostly they're apart. In fact, of course, every breath of air we take, and in the city, every breath of air we take is not just the oxygen that's coming into our lungs, but how much soot and pollution is a product of how many trees are around us. And so these webs are interdigitated, interwoven in ways that dissolve boundaries.
Exactly.
And also, I think, suggest ways forward. If we don't think of ourselves as separate, no longer can we just push trees off to the side as an afterthought in planning for urban areas, or how suburban development will be put in, or how we're going to restore green into places where it has been either through active policy removed, or through neglect, or through the various other ways in which green space is lost from cities.
And so, in other words, you're saying that we are directly interconnected with all of the trees and all of nature, and that when we destroy one tree, that should send a wave throughout humanity, because we are all interconnected. Yes?
Absolutely, and that connection is I mean, it sounds mystical and abstract, but for me, it's really about the sensory engagement with trees. So a city street that has got some trees on it smells a little different. The sound is a little brighter because each leaf acts as a reflector for sound coming back to us. When it rains, there's a different sound, there's a different aroma.
Yes.
And then downstream from the street, of course, then as the rain comes, the tree acts as a sponge and something that slows down the flow of water. So there are downstream benefits. And trees change how we behave on the street as well. A street that has no trees on it, there's nowhere to hang out and gather in the shade. There's nowhere to get out of the flow of pedestrian traffic. And so in ways that are quite measurable, for example, the amount of pollution coming into our lungs, but also in ways that are harder to pin down, for example, how trees work to produce a healthy human set of interactions out on the street. It's harder to measure. It's not impossible to measure, but it is harder to measure.
Well,
in all these ways.
If you wouldn't mind talking about how trees affect our cognitive abilities, David.
Sure. Why don't I pass to Jeff here, who's done. I'd be interested in hearing his thoughts on that. I can certainly add my own hypotheses. But.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a good segue, because I, as a psychologist, I come at this from kind of that psychological perspective, which also looks at, you know, how our relationship with nature affects our cognition, affects our emotional states. And, you know, building a little bit on what David was talking about, eco-psychology, which is kind of a field that's theoretically and philosophically, I feel kind of closest to, has this idea that they've coined the ecological unconscious, that there's this very archaic part of ourselves that is very deeply connected to the living and natural world, similar to kind of ideas that Jung talked about with the collective unconscious. But looking at nature, you know, even beyond its symbolic meaning to us. And I think that, you know, the industrialism has kind of led to a little bit of a perceived consciousness split in terms of humans thinking that they are somewhat separate from nature. And this perspective really says that there's great harm in that duality when humans actually start to cognitively think about themselves as being separate. And that there's actually great and pain and suffering from a psychological standpoint, until we actually realize that we are splitting ourselves off, that there's actually great emotional suffering and pain that's actually being somewhat repressed within all of us, and our true selves aren't being actually fully realized as we are thinking that we're separate from the living beings that we are a part of. So from that perspective, until that healing kind of occurs, we're not going to have this sympathetic bond with nature that is really inherent within us. And so I think that kind of echoes these ideas of connection, and that, you know, these systems that we put into place that on the surface might tell us that we are actually above nature, that we can control nature, are actually just kind of apocryphal, right? There, as David mentioned, there is no split between culture and biology and natural systems. But a lot of us cognitively, I think that. And so I think connection is when we see that idea of ourselves as being totally embedded within a natural system, and our health, not just our physical health in terms of water and air, but our mental health really being dependent upon our awareness and our recognition of that.
And so this is why I researched before I came up with using nature as a healing conduit as the mission statement for Hero Nurturing Center. So I'm so thrilled to be having this conversation with all of you to confirm all of that, what I've researched. And 7 countries, and I know you guys know this, other continents have done the research, like Japan and Sweden and others have done the research. And Japan has even instituted forest bathing as a national therapy. And I'm hoping, with the help of David and others that I work with, to have that done in Massachusetts. And I've been working on that. So I'm hoping that you guys would support that as well, right? Because the research, and to segue into the healing part, is that nature is a healer, yes? And time spent in green spaces. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of our emotional well-being on that level?
Yeah, I think that over the past probably 25 years, there's been a lot of research in that area, Western scientific research, which is kind of looking at the cause and effect of time spent in nature, how that impacts our stress levels, how that impacts our attentional capacities. There was a theory that was put forth kind of in the late 1880s called the attention restoration theory, which was saying that time in nature actually gives our time in nature gives our brains actually time to recover. Yes. Right. So when you're trying to take a study break, and we go in front of a screen, or we go on a walk in a busy industrial street with no trees or no nature on it, that our brain is actually not actually going through a recovery process, but this idea of soft fascination in nature allows our attentional capacities to kind of recover and reboot, and allows us to recharge, and we get back to whatever activities that we're doing. So from an attentional standpoint, from a stress standpoint, from an anxiety standpoint, we've seen lots of research studies that are looking at this relationship. And I think, it starts to get into really tricky territory when we start asking ourselves the question of what's the right dosage of nature, which is a lot of times what's being asked by medical practitioners and people that are implementing programs in schools. How much do we actually need? And, I think it's a necessary question to ask, but I think it starts to reduce our relationship down with nature in terms of we can quantify it within 30 or 45 or 60 minutes a day. And I think it's a lot more complex than that. I think it's great if people do get that exposure. But I think we also have to keep in mind the more holistic spiritual element of our relationship with nature that can't necessarily be pinned down to minutes. How are we spending our time in nature? How are we engaging? How are we paying attention to things? What senses are being activated when we're in nature? Is our experience being facilitated by a smartphone, or are we actually, directly interacting and engaging? So there's all sorts of ways in which our relationship with nature is impacted by these contextual pieces. But I think sometimes we want to be able to reduce it down in our society to say, this is what you need. And I think that, we have to keep in mind that there's individual differences, and some people might really benefit from lots of time, and some people might benefit from less time. So, but yeah, the research is actually confirming what people have known for generations and generations and generations, that nature is healing. But because of the society that we live in, we often need Western science to quote unquote prove that or confirm that. But people have known that for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yes, and so that gives me another segue into there's a study that says even after you've had surgery, then being out in nature and actually being able to see the greenery will enable you to recover faster, and they have scientific studies to prove that.
Yeah, that was really the kind of landmark study in the early 1980s that put this whole field of research kind of on the map. And if we actually look at, I think it was recovery from gallbladder surgery, and they had some patients looking out on kind of a paved parking lot and others looking out on a green space.
Yes, precisely.
And if we look at the way our design of hospitals and of schools and of other public spaces, and how sometimes they're not necessarily implementing a lot of these findings that we found that are really helpful.
Yes.
So I think this relationship, our relationship with trees, our relationship with nature, spills over into design and to architecture, and how we can really hold that in mind as we build spaces for people that are now spending 95% of their time indoors. Nowadays, even more than that, probably.
Absolutely.
How can architecture and design be part of that equation that really looks at our relationship with nature and how we can facilitate through design processes as well?
And not only that, the more that we are in a calmer state, right? The more that we have facilitated being with nature, we'll have lowered our blood pressure, right? We'll have released a lot of our cognitive stresses that we've accumulated over time, work, home, and just life in general, right? And one more thing, more trees decreases the noise of the city streets. And so hopefully this conversation and others that our wonderful host David has put together will spurn policy and move the conversation from, just talk and discussion onto actual enactment of some of these policies that the studies from the 80s, he said, were done. And so how can we then help to facilitate the speeding up of these policies? Because after we come out of this, hopefully we'll come out of this hole, we'll need, and some of us will need more healing than others. So how can we then facilitate more nature for folks after all of this, being quarantined is over? We'll need more greenery than ever. Anyone, jump in, guys.
Sure. Well, Judy, I'd be really interested to hear about your work with Hero and how this, you've done some amazing things in actually bringing these things into being in communities. And certainly I can offer some thoughts, but I'd be really fascinated to hear your experience and some of the goals and strategies that you've had.
Well, my background for folks is I was born in Jamaica, and I'm just loving the background that David Haskell is having us look at. It's beautiful and it's pristine, and it's precisely something like that I grew up in as a child. And so my love of nature is innate. And my son, Paul, who is the inspiration for all of this, he passed away. He was murdered in 2013. And he was 3 months away from graduating from college. It was Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so instead of, burying his seed, so to speak, I decided to water the seed. He was a lover of nature. He loved going barefoot. No matter how you told the boy, put shoes on, he would just, defy all odds and direction and just go out barefoot. And so one of the things that I had promised to do is to take him to Jamaica after he graduated from college. And because he wasn't able to do that, I thought, okay, well, how can I honor his memory? And so the love of nature was the next best thing. And so that's the background of why I created the Hero Nurturing Center, and just my love of nature as well. And, my healing. So I have lots of trauma that I won't get into the details of how I got them. And one of the things that healed me from broken bones and nerves being shattered is spending a lot of time in nature. And so I had to do the research before I implemented it as a program. And this is how I came across the Japanese forest bathing. And so in doing all of the research, I found that other countries have researched it. But from my own experiences, being in the medical field, I'll tell you a corny story. I worked for Partners Healthcare in Newton. in Waban Square in particular. And at my lunch breaks, because I was so stressed from the job that I had, and I didn't want that stress to parlay over to the patients or the people that I worked with. And I had no idea why my intuition was sending me. I would go into the yard. It was a beautiful yard filled with trees. And I wouldn't care the clothing I had on or how expensive my dress was. I would just lay myself in the grass for my entire lunch break on the earth and just close my eyes and just become one with the grass. And I found it to be so healing and so settling and balancing that I just kept doing it, ever, and under trees. So my favorite tree is the ackee tree. It's a tree that grows in the Caribbean. It's a tropical plant. And it's a beautiful fruit tree. And so I just love trees. And that's just a little bit of my background in loving trees, David Haskell. So thank you for asking.
Wow, that's just such a powerful story about the transformative power of getting out of oneself a little bit, reaching out into that network of life, and letting some of the energy come back to sustain us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this, as you were both talking, I was thinking about of course, there are psychological ways that trees really sustain and help us. But often, and particularly in education, we've lost track of the sort of direct physical ways in which our lives, minute by minute, are sustained by trees. The simplest example, of course, is the oxygen that we breathe. About half of it came from the plankton in the ocean and half from the land, mostly trees, but also grasses. So just every breath, we're connected in that way. But also the foods that support our cultures and civilizations around the world, whether it's the olive tree in the Mediterranean, which was the foundation of for the last 8,000 years, the foundation of how people could live in an arid land was working in symbiosis with this tree, or nut trees, particularly hazelnuts in the northern part of the hemisphere, fruit trees, oil palm trees, more in tropical areas that have been for millennia have been really important, and now some of them are being industrialized, particularly oil palm, which is creating some problems with deforestation.
Yes.
Again and again, the calories that are coming into our bodies put us in direct relationship with trees, and even those foodstuffs that are coming from annual crops like wheat and corn, and the wheat and corn that's fed to animals if we're omnivorous. Those crops too are sustained by trees, because what regulates the rainfall pattern over most continents is partly generated through forests. And so in agricultural areas, even if they're completely treeless plains, the rainfall there is partly dependent on healthy forests upwind or in some other part of the continent. So there's a psychological aspect, there's a spiritual aspect to this, but there's also at its core very deep physical.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And so that brings us to, again, how we connect to nature and nature connects to us, the symbiotic relationship. Yes. So we can't do without trees. And so when you talked about erosion, right? Talk about the fact that if we don't have enough trees, when storms come, we can't withstand storms and hurricanes and the like. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that affects us, whether it be physically, emotionally, and mentally?
Joel, from as I'm listening to your question, the word that's coming into my mind is resilience. In what way can our work with trees help us not avoid the changes that we're in but actually be able to? We know that the world is changing. We know that there will be storms.
Yes.
That there will be challenges to our society. In what way can trees make us stronger and be able to receive and bend and then bounce back? And specifically in cities, as particularly with temperatures going up, trees help cool the city. That's one very direct benefit that's measurable. It's usually in big cities worth tens of millions of dollars in saved air conditioning costs. On the coast, trees, whether it's mangroves in the tropics or palm trees and dunes in the subtropics, or extended pine barrens and salt marshes, and the trees behind the salt marshes more up in the temperate zone. All of those things buffer us from the effects of hurricanes and sea level rise. And trees are not the only part of that story, but they're very important.
Very important. And
Hey,
so
Judith,
there,
yeah, could I just interrupt for a minute? 'Cause
yes,
we've had some really wonderful questions come up
great.
in the chat box, and I wanted to make sure that we left time for audience participation. So Evan, is there anything that caught your mind that we can maybe share?
Yeah, actually, I do want to ask a question, maybe starting with David, about, we're talking about trees in different places and different environments. And, I think a lot of us think about the trees in New England that we can experience around us right now, but I'm curious, this is a question originally from Larry, what's known about how people connect to nature and to trees in different environments? I know you looked at trees throughout the world and followed them in different cities. And is there a difference if you're in a warmer place, a colder place, a harsher place, a calmer place, as far as how people connect to trees? Is it different, or is it just a universal human thing?
Well, if I may take the first go at that, for me, coming from the Caribbean and just visited Cuba twice in the last 2 years, I would say it would have resounding yes. And I'll use the ceiba tree as a perfect example. And it's also known as the cottonwood tree, the silk cottonwood specifically, and the balboa, it's also called in other places. Now, that particular tree is thousands of years old, and people use it for spiritual gratification, sacrifices, offerings, and they actually believe that being around this tree is a healing. There's a healing component to it, and that there's a spiritual connection to it. And you'll see people just meandering under the tree. And then also in Jamaica, you'll see people cooking under a tree. You see them, just hanging out under a tree and just doing lots of things under a tree versus here in America.
Yeah, I would say, those are wonderful examples. And in my own work, I found that trees are right at the center of stories of meaning and of origins around the world. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions to that. I haven't done a thorough study of all origin stories, but across cultures, whether it's the Guarani indigenous people in the Amazon, or in the Abrahamic traditions, of course, there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The Norse ash tree that connects the underworlds and the many overworlds, and the earth rotates in its meaning around that. So again and again, trees have this incredibly important symbolic value, but also at a practical level, connections are there, but they take really different forms. And the idea of being under a tree and conducting trade under a tree in New York City, that's where a lot of street vendors would much rather be, and there's actually competition on the street for, if you've got the spot under the tree in the summer, you're going to have a much easier work day than if you got the spot where the sun is just beating down on you, and you put up an umbrella, but it's not as good as being under the tree. So the form of connection is very different in different places. Of course, in the tropics, if you just turn around on a piece of cleared land for, it seems like just a few minutes, the trees are back. There's this incredibly fast growth rate, which leads to a certain agricultural dynamic of how you can work with the land compared to in the temperate zone or even the boreal, where the growth rates are much slower. And of course, in the form of human tree interaction then shifts. So yes, indeed, there is a universal connection across cultures, but the way it manifests, and this is one of the motivations for me writing the Songs of Trees, the manifestation of that is so revealing about our culture and the many meanings and interconnections that we have with trees.
So here's a question, because we're talking about these kind of symbolic value of trees and how a single tree can have such a large impact depending on where it is and its context. And yet, as Jeff was talking about earlier, there's a shift to really quantify and measure the value of trees. And we've been talking about this in terms of the value of heating, the value of cooling in the summer or other kind of health benefits. But there's also an interest in quantifying the psychological value of nature, or even the psychological impact of nature interventions. In other words, if you bring a kid to a tree, can we actually measure how much happier that kid is? And if we can, then maybe we can get more grant funding to bring more kids to trees. So I'd like to hear about the kind of programming and policy implications behind measuring how people feel about trees, or how people benefit from trees and nature, and where that's part of the conversation. Jeff, can we start with you on how people are measuring and what that means for our world?
Absolutely. Thanks, Evan. I think that this idea of measuring connection, it leads us back to this question of what is it, right? And how do we measure it? How do we conceptualize it? How do we operationalize it? And I think one thing that I felt passionately about in kind of the environmental education field was that we didn't just focus on STEM-oriented outcomes, like just focusing on what kids cognitively knew about nature, but we could also think about how they felt and how being in nature made them feel, because that emotional connection, there's a lot of research that demonstrates an emotional affinity towards nature is one of the foundational elements of people growing up to become environmental stewards and protectors of nature. So when we talk about all these things that trees offer us, I'm often thinking about, well, who's going to be the next generation of protectors and stewards of the trees? And mentorship is huge. And emotional connection is huge, and firsthand experience. So if we can start to have some awareness of what's happening when kids are interacting with trees or interacting with gardens, and we can start to kind of measure it, realizing that we have to reduce it down to variables and there's flaws in that, but also realizing that for a lot of funding agencies, for a lot of agencies that are providing means for these really important programs that you all are involved in to exist, oftentimes they want to see quantifiable data points. And I think that, we're starting to, I don't know if David, if you can throw up that inclusion of nature scale, this is such a simple measure, which researchers have started to use with kids. And talking about how they identify with nature, because you can't necessarily always ask kids, little kids, survey questions. So this is actually a visual orientation that's been used as an outcome study, starting before a program, how do you think of yourself in relationship to nature? Then, after a program, how do you think of yourself? And just having kids kind of simply circle the set of circles that feels most representative to them. And this is just kind of a quick and fast way. Is it simplistic? Is it reductionist? Yes. But does it give us some sense of what's happening with kids' relationship when they're in gardens, when they're in forests? It's helpful to start to think about lessening that dichotomy and how we can start to look at that with some of these really simple measures for little kids.
Here's another question about access to nature that I want to highlight from the chat. We have a comment from Devin that not everyone has access to trees and nature, and often we see that wealthier neighborhoods might have more trees, and that the more resources you have, the more access you have to nature. I'd be curious to hear from each of you, perhaps as a final comment before we move to our quiz bowl. A good example or a challenge, either a positive or a negative that you see from a real example in the world of how cities or communities are trying to improve access to nature to get at this question of inequality. How can we make sure that everyone has access, or that the people who need it the most have access to nature in a way that's valuable? So I'm looking for either a good example or a challenge that you see, perhaps from each of you.
I mean, I could,
yeah, go ahead,
I do
David.
think the question is extraordinarily important one. Like the thing that we need to be addressed is this inequality. We now know scientifically measured these benefits, and we can also measure that these benefits are massively unequally distributed across our neighborhoods and communities. No, I don't know of any city that's doing a perfect job on this. New York City's Million Trees project, ongoing project, we took a proactive approach to tree planting instead of just waiting for people to call and say, hey, come and fix my neighborhood. And of course, those tended to be the people who had the time and for whom like the lack of a tree outside was their number one problem that day. And that, you know, that's a pretty small swath of the society. Instead, they mapped out where areas where there were whole neighborhoods that didn't have many trees, and where there were neighborhoods where people were having a lot of lung issues, so hospitalizations for lung problems, and where those two things overlapped, go in and plant up the whole neighborhood with street trees. So that was getting ahead of this problem by using measures from the city of human health and of lack of trees. And this slide here this is from a few years ago, that the tag has changed now, but circling back to the question of quantifying things, you can quantify how well trees are doing in relation to their connection to us. So when you plant a city tree and just leave it, it's got a 50-50 chance of still being there in 10 years because it's a challenging place for a tree to grow. But if you involve people from the neighborhood and give the tree a little tag with a name and so on, so in other words, give it a name, an identity, and a place in human social networks, then that tree's probability of survival goes way up, in some cases to nearly 100%. So we can measure the benefit of connection to trees for humans. You can also measure the benefit for connection to humans from the trees angle as well. So it's like going both ways.
That's a great example, David. And Jeff, how about you next? An example of an organization, community, city that's doing something positive about access to nature.
Yeah, I first want to just echo the inequities and how much of this is a social justice issue even before people are born. We're starting to see research that's linking tree coverage in neighborhoods and the health of newborn infants. And so it's happening right from the start. So it's a major issue, access, and I think what's going on now is putting that under the microscope. I think a lot of us already knew it. And now, because of this pandemic, it's being highlighted, you know, all across the globe, in essence. An organization that's close to my heart is City Sprouts, which is kind of a local example in Cambridge and Boston. And I think City Sprouts works with schools to implement school gardens and facilitates teachers using the gardens and the outdoor space to actually deliver their curriculum. So it's not seen as something additional for teachers. It's actually seen as a helpful tool to get them to teach kids about math and science and social studies and even English. And I think in going and visiting these gardens all across Cambridge and Boston, the pride that the kids have in showing you the plants that they grew from seed all the way to the fall when they come back and they're harvesting, you know, these zucchini and these tomatoes. And it goes back to that whole identity piece, right? Giving people a sense of pride and ownership and identity over their neighborhood and their community. So letting them realize that nature exists in their communities. I think a lot of times we want to sensationalize nature to what we see on National Geographic or the Discovery Channel. And I think that makes kids feel like nature is somewhere else. I mean, there is some great programming on those shows, don't get me wrong, but I think that we have to focus on local local and contextual and ways in which kids can get involved in their own neighborhoods. And I'm a big proponent of firsthand experience. And when kids have that, I think their relationship with nature deepens in a way that doesn't happen if they don't have it.
And so Judy, let's end with you with an example of something, of a story of access that's going well for you.
Well, what's going well is the partnership with Speak for the Trees. And so that has been really, really inspiring for me, that there's an organization out there who is aware of the problem and is willing to provide a solution in partnership with someone who is from the community, because I grew up in Dorchester as a little girl. And so a challenge that we're facing, and if David doesn't mind my speaking on his behalf, is that when I first came up with the idea for Massachusetts, for Boston and Dorchester in particular, I find that finding the tools and the support in terms of policy where the mayor's office is concerned, or the governor's office, or whichever entities that would foster this to become a program where we can get prescriptions for nature as other countries do, instead of the Zoloft, or in conjunction, but access nature as a healing conduit. And so that's the challenge for me. And I'm hoping that with all of you viewing, you could help by donating to David Meshalom and helping me to get, whether it be volunteers, resources, or what have you, so that the state and the city will enact this as a public program for people to feel healthier.
Well, thank you, Judy. And we're
Evan,
at the.
can I just jump in real quick? Because I
Yes.
think everyone here shared so much important stuff, and I just wanted to highlight how the work we're doing is exactly around this issue of equity and environmental justice, with a focus on trees here in Boston specific. And our work is getting trees out to residents as a way for them to not only feel like they have a healthier and actually have a healthier environment, but I think to Jeff's point, and to Judy's point, and to David's point, is that it's an entry point for them to be part of something bigger, to be part of a bigger conversation. It's that gateway in to exploring other natural spaces. So it's an authentic experience, and that's the importance for us around bringing trees to people. So I wanted to thank our three panelists today for joining us and sharing their stories. I know we still have, Evan, I don't want to cut you off. I know we still have our quiz bowl. You're muted.
Sorry, yes, I was about to change my virtual background to my quiz bowl background, but
there we go.
Save that for later.
Well, while you do that, I wanted to share people with what our contestants are playing for. We have here a double-sided, multi-sized. You can choose your own size, personal size. Larry, I see you. You won one last time. Speak for the Trees t-shirt. And then we also have, David, stop me if I'm overstepping my bounds, but I believe David is going to be donating a signed copy of his beautiful book, The Songs of Trees. And even for those of you who don't win this book, or you don't have a chance, I highly encourage you not only to buy it and to read it, but I also encourage you to go out and listen to your trees right now. They're saying a lot, especially this time of year. And I think they're giving an important perspective for us. We just have to take the time right now in our front yards, on our streets, to listen to these trees. So thank you, David, for that offer.
All right, so I have my virtual background, but I think I'll have to work on it. It says Quiz Bowl, but I think the colors are inverted. Anyway, today, David and Jeff are going to be playing a Quiz Bowl on behalf of two audience members. So thank you, Karen and Jessica, for being our lucky volunteers. We heard about how we measure connection to nature, and the two psychologists that created the connectedness to nature scale, originally from Oberlin College. And so the topic of our Quiz Bowl today is Oberlin College, which has a long history of environmentalism on its campus. And so David and Jeff, I'll each ask you two multiple choice questions. Jeff, if you win, Karen Beckstein will be winning a t-shirt. David, if you win, Jessica will be winning a t-shirt. And we'll be sending both of you a signed book from David Haskell. So congratulations already. First question to Jeff. Which of the following is the current Oberlin mascot? A, the Crimson Knights. B, an albino squirrel. Or C, Obie the owl.
Oh, wow.
They didn't use my question.
Yeah, Richard, sorry, Richard submitted a question and we changed the theme this time. I'll email you after.
Right.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Can you repeat the answer choices for me one more time?
Yes, A, the Crimson
That's going to help me.
It might not. B, an albino squirrel. Or C, Obie the owl.
I'm going to go with Obie the owl.
Oh, Obie is the name of the mascot, but it's actually an albino squirrel. There's a robust population in Oberlin College.
Oh, okay.
David, next question to you. Oberlin College set what year as their goal for carbon neutrality? A, 2025, B, 2030, or C, 2050?
25, I would guess.
You're right. Ding, 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 ding. Very aggressive carbon neutrality goal. All right, Jeff, here's your chance again. Next question. The Oberlin Arboretum got its start in 1892 when it purchased a green space designated as the only suitable place for young women to walk alone. What was the name of this green space? A, Pine Park, B, Mary Fletcher Kellogg Garden, or C, the Ladies' Grove?
I'm going to go with B.
She was one of the first women to graduate with a degree from Oberlin College, but in fact, it is the Ladies' Grove. So I don't even need to read the next question to tell you that David is our winner. So congratulations to Jessica, who won the t-shirt. And I'll be emailing both of you about getting you your shirts and your books. So thank you both for taking this quiz. And I'll pass it back to you, David, for final words.
Thank you all. So 2 things before we go. I am putting on a poll for you all, for all the users. If you could take a minute, we just like to collect data here, some basic questions. Just 5 brief questions if you don't mind. And while you're taking that poll, I'm just gonna announce our next series, our next community conversation, I should say, in our speaker series, Keeping Curious, Talking Trees, will be on Thursday, April 30th at 4 p.m. Same place, same room. And we're going to be joined by 2 researchers at the Arnold Arboretum, and then 1 graduate student over at BU. And the title of that talk will be Making the Invisible Visible at the Arnold Arboretum. I don't know if I throw up a slide if it will cover the poll, so I'll just wait a minute. But you can also, I'll put it in the chat window here, keep in touch either on our website, which I'll post here. It's sfttbos.org. That's S as in speak, F as in for, T as in the, and T as in trees. BOS for Boston.org. And our handle on social media is the same, sfttbos. So I wanted to thank all our participants and all of you for joining today. I think trees have always held a special place for humanity. I think as we now are feeling increasingly isolated in our homes, they're a way to reconnect not only us to nature and us to our neighbors, but more importantly, us to ourselves. So if you have a tree near you, admire it, cherish it, watch it change, and remember that it's been there for years. Hopefully it's been there for decades, and hopefully it'll be there for decades yet. And every year it blossoms, and then the leaves fall, and it lies dormant. And hopefully during this moment of rebirth, we can take a moment to, think about that tree as our own personal rebirth and the rebirth of our humanity, of our shared humanity together. And I think remembering that and holding hope in these times is really important. So I welcome you to join us in our work here in Boston at Speak for the Trees. I have 300 trees, like I said, looking for homes, thanks to Bartlett Trees. Help me get them out if you have any ideas. I would love any thoughtful, socially distanced, safe ways to get these trees out to residents. We're doing a couple of different ways, but I have more trees than I imagined I would. So with that, thank you. I'm going to share my screen one last time with our final announcement, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you, David. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, everyone else.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Larry. Nice to see you.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for joining.
See you next time.
Yeah. So it looks like the polling is done. You can end the polling. Some really great feedback, guys. Hi, Renata.